The phone call came at 3:17 in the morning. David Martinez had been asleep for barely 2 hours when the shrill ring cut through the silence of his empty house. On the other end, a voice he didn't recognise spoke words that would shatter everything he thought he knew about love, trust, and the woman he'd planned to marry. Immigration enforcement, domestic violence charges, deportation proceedings. As he sat there in his boxer shorts, staring at the divorce papers scattered across his coffee table from 6 months earlier, David realised that the gentle, vulnerable woman he'd rescued from poverty had just destroyed his life with a few carefully crafted lies. But I'm getting ahead of myself. If you wanted to hear stories like this one, stories that will make you question everything you think you know about love and manipulation, hit that subscribe button right now. Because what happened to David could happen to anyone, and the warning signs were there from the very beginning. David Martinez was 53 years old when his world first fell apart. Not from the immigration call, that would come later, but from the cancer that took his wife Elena after 28 years of marriage. They'd built a life together in Phoenix, Arizona, a modest but comfortable existence. David worked as a senior technician for a telecommunications company. Elena taught elementary school. They'd tried for children, but it never happened, so they poured their love into each other, into their small garden, into the quiet Sunday mornings that stretched endlessly and beautifully before them. When Elena died, something fundamental broke inside David. Not just his heart, though that shattered completely, but his sense of purpose. The house felt like a mausoleum. Her coffee cup still sat in the sink. Her reading glasses remained folded on the nightstand next to a half-finished crossword puzzle. For months, David barely functioned. He went to work, came home, ate frozen dinners in front of the television, and tried not to think about the 40 years of life he'd planned to spend with a woman who would never walk through the front door again. His sister Carmen worried. His co-workers worried. Even the mailman, Mrs. Rodriguez from next door, everyone could see that David was disappearing into himself. It was Carmen who finally convinced him to try online dating. Not for love, she said, just for companionship. Just so he wouldn't spend every evening talking to Elena's photographs. David resisted for months, but loneliness is a powerful motivator. On a rainy Thursday in October, exactly 1 year and 3 months after Elena's funeral, David created a profile on an international dating site. He told himself he was just looking for friendship, someone to share a meal with occasionally, someone who might help him remember what it felt like to laugh. He never intended to fall in love again. Love was something that happened once, if you were lucky, and David had used up his lifetime quota with Elena. But the heart, as David would learn, doesn't always consult the mind before making its decisions. Her name was Lila Chen, and her profile picture showed a woman with kind eyes and a shy smile, standing in what looked like a small apartment with faded wallpaper. She was 34, originally from a rural province in Vietnam, working as a seamstress in Ho Chi Minh City. Her English was broken but earnest, filled with the endearing mistakes that made David smile for the first time in months. She wrote about her dreams of seeing America, of building a better life, of finding someone who would treat her with kindness and respect. Their first conversation lasted 4 hours. David found himself telling her about Elena, about the emptiness that had consumed his life, about the way grief felt like drowning in slow motion. Lila listened, or at least that's how it seemed through the typed words that appeared on his screen. She shared her own story of hardship, of working 16-hour days for barely enough money to survive, of family members who depended on her meagre income. There was something about her vulnerability that called to David's protective instincts, the same instincts that had made him the kind of husband who brought Elena flowers every Friday for 28 years. They talked every day for 3 weeks before Lila mentioned her financial struggles. It wasn't a direct request, nothing so crude. Instead, she told him about her landlord threatening eviction, about choosing between medicine for her sick grandmother and paying rent. David found himself offering to help before he'd consciously made the decision. $200, he said, just to tide her over. Lila's gratitude was overwhelming, embarrassing almost. She called him her guardian angel, her saviour, the answer to prayers she'd stopped believing anyone would hear. The money transfer was surprisingly easy. David had never sent money internationally before, but the app walked him through every step. Within hours, Lila was sending him photos of groceries she'd bought, medicine for her grandmother, a small bouquet of flowers she'd purchased just because his kindness had made her feel beautiful for the first time in years. David felt something he hadn't experienced since Elena's death, the satisfaction of being needed, of making a difference in someone's life. What started as occasional conversations became daily video calls. Lila would show him her tiny apartment, introduce him to her neighbours, share meals with him across 8,000 miles. She was everything Elena hadn't been, exotic, mysterious, grateful for every small kindness. Where Elena had been independent and strong, Lila was fragile and dependent. Where Elena had challenged David intellectually, Lila made him feel protective and masculine in ways he'd forgotten were possible. The red flags started small. Lila's stories didn't always add up. She'd mentioned working at a garment factory, then later said she was a freelance seamstress. Her grandmother was dying, then recovered, then sick again. The apartment she showed him on video calls sometimes looked different, as if she'd rearranged everything between conversations. But David was lonely, and lonely people have an extraordinary capacity for explaining away inconsistencies. The first time she asked for money to visit a sick relative, David sent $500 without question. The second time, for emergency dental work, he sent $300. By the time she started talking about wanting to visit America, about how wonderful it would be to meet him in person, David had sent over $2,000. Each transfer came with elaborate expressions of gratitude, promises that she would pay him back, and increasingly intimate conversations about their future together. It was Lila who first mentioned marriage. Not directly, but through hints and suggestions that grew bolder with each conversation. She talked about how different her life would be in America, how grateful she would be to any man kind enough to help her start over. She showed him pictures of traditional Vietnamese wedding ceremonies, spoke wistfully about finding someone who would love her despite her humble origins. David found himself imagining Elena's empty closet filled with Lila's clothes, her musical laughter replacing the oppressive silence that had haunted his house for over a year. The courtship, if it could be called that, accelerated rapidly once David mentioned marriage as a possibility. Suddenly, Lila needed money for passport fees, for visa applications, for medical examinations required for immigration. Each expense was carefully documented with official-looking papers that David couldn't read but had no reason to doubt. The total climbed to $8,000, then $12,000, then $15,000. David liquidated savings accounts he and Elena had built over decades, telling himself that love required sacrifice, that Lila's gratitude and devotion were worth any price. When Lila finally arrived in Phoenix, David barely recognized her. The woman who stepped off the plane was harder somehow, her smile more practiced, her eyes calculating in ways that hadn't been apparent through video calls. She was beautiful, exactly as beautiful as her pictures, but there was something different about her presence, something that made David feel like he was meeting a stranger who happened to share a face with the woman he'd fallen in love with. The first few weeks were everything David had dreamed they would be. Lila was grateful, affectionate, eager to please. She cooked elaborate meals, kept the house spotless, made David feel like the most important man in the world. She marvelled at everything, the grocery store, the mall, the simple luxury of hot water that never ran out. Her wonder was infectious, reminding David of how much he'd taken for granted in his own life. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, things began to change. Lila's gratitude started to feel performative, her affection conditional on David's continued generosity. She needed money for English classes, for a phone, for clothes that would help her fit in with American women. Each request was reasonable on its surface, but the frequency and urgency increased with each passing week. David found himself walking on eggshells, afraid that any hesitation or question about expenses would be interpreted as a lack of love or commitment. The wedding was small, just a courthouse ceremony with Carmen and her husband as witnesses. Carmen had expressed concerns about the speed of everything, about David's obvious infatuation with a woman he'd known for less than 6 months. But David was determined to prove that happiness was still possible, that Elena's death hadn't condemned him to a life of solitude. Lila cried during the ceremony, tears that David interpreted as joy but might have been something else entirely. The green card application process began immediately. Lila was anxious about it, constantly worried about interviews and documentation. She studied American culture obsessively, practicing answers to questions immigration officers might ask. David helped her, coaching her on their love story, making sure she knew important details about his life and family. He was touched by her dedication, interpreting her anxiety as proof of how desperately she wanted to build a life with him. But as the months passed, Lila's behaviour became increasingly erratic. She was moody, prone to explosive arguments over trivial matters. She accused David of not trusting her when he asked about her spending, of treating her like a servant when he requested help with household tasks. The grateful, loving woman he'd married was disappearing, replaced by someone demanding and manipulative. The first time she threatened to call the police, David thought she was joking. They'd argued about money, about her insistence that she needed $3,000 to help her family back in Vietnam. David had said no, gently but firmly, explaining that they needed to budget more carefully. Lila's response was swift and chilling. She would tell people he was abusing her, she said. She would claim he'd hit her, forced her to have sex, isolated her from making friends. David was stunned into silence, unable to comprehend how their marriage had reached this point. The threats became a regular part of their relationship. Any disagreement, any moment when David asserted himself or questioned Lila's demands, was met with promises of police reports and abuse allegations. David found himself giving in to increasingly unreasonable requests just to avoid conflict. He was walking through his own life like a man crossing a minefield, never knowing which step might trigger an explosion. Lila's behaviour outside the house was completely different. With neighbours, with David's co-workers at company barbecues, with anyone who might matter to her immigration status, she was the perfect grateful immigrant wife. She smiled constantly, deferred to David in all matters, spoke glowingly about how wonderful her life in America had become. David began to feel like he was living with two different people: the charming woman everyone else saw, and the increasingly hostile stranger who shared his bed. The psychological manipulation was subtle but relentless. Lila reminded David constantly of how much he needed her, how lonely and pathetic his life had been before she arrived. She pointed out his age, his weight gain since Elena's death, his social awkwardness with women. Without her, she implied, he would die alone and forgotten. The cruel irony was that David had felt more alone in the 10 months since Lila's arrival than he had in the entire year after Elena's death. Financial control came next. Lila needed access to bank accounts to pay household bills, she said. She needed credit cards for emergencies. Gradually, she took over all family finances, monitoring David's spending, while her own became increasingly extravagant. David's protests were met with tears, accusations that he didn't trust her, threats to leave and take half his assets in divorce proceedings. He found himself trapped between his fear of being alone again and his growing awareness that he was being systematically robbed. The isolation was perhaps the cruelest part. Lila discouraged David from seeing his sister, claiming that Carmen didn't like her and was trying to destroy their marriage. She found fault with his friends, his hobbies, anything that took his attention away from her needs and demands. Slowly, David's world shrank until it consisted of work, home, and the constant anxiety of managing Lila's moods and expectations. David's breaking point came on a Tuesday evening in March, almost exactly 2 years after Lila's arrival. He'd discovered that she'd withdrawn $7,000 from their joint savings account without telling him. When he confronted her, demanding an explanation, Lila's response was swift and devastating. She called 911 while David watched in horror, sobbing into the phone about her abusive husband who had just threatened to kill her. The police arrived within minutes. David found himself explaining to 2 officers that there had been no violence, no threats, just a conversation about money. But Lila was convincing, her tears genuine, her English suddenly fluent enough to paint a detailed picture of ongoing abuse and intimidation. She showed them bruises on her arms that David had never seen before, claimed they were from earlier incidents she'd been too afraid to report. David spent that night in jail, charged with domestic violence based entirely on Lila's testimony. His bail was set at $20,000, money that Lila now controlled. Carmen bailed him out the next morning, her face a mixture of fury and heartbreak as she watched her brother emerge from lockup looking like a broken man. The restraining order came next, barring David from his own home. He moved into a motel while lawyers explained the severity of his situation. Domestic violence charges could result in prison time, they said. Deportation proceedings for Lila would be suspended while she was considered a victim of abuse. The system that was supposed to protect vulnerable immigrants was being weaponized against the very man who had tried to help one. Living in that motel room, eating takeout food and watching his life crumble on the evening news, local news had picked up the story of the immigrant wife and her abusive American husband David finally understood the depth of his situation. This hadn't been a marriage that went wrong. This had been a long-term con, planned and executed with surgical precision. Every moment of gratitude, every expression of love, every tear shed during their courthouse wedding had been part of an elaborate performance designed to secure legal residency and access to an American man's assets. The evidence of the con was overwhelming once David started looking for it. Phone records showed that Lila had been in contact with several other American men throughout their relationship. Financial records revealed systematic transfers to accounts in Vietnam that had nothing to do with sick relatives or family emergencies. Even more disturbing, David discovered online forums where women shared strategies for manipulating American men through false abuse allegations, complete with instructions on how to create convincing bruises and what to say to police officers. But knowing the truth and proving it were two different things. The legal system was designed to protect genuine victims of domestic violence, which meant that Lila's word carried more weight than David's evidence. His lawyers warned him that fighting the charges aggressively might be seen as further abuse, additional evidence of his controlling nature. The safest strategy, they said, was to accept a plea deal and hope for minimal jail time. David refused, not because he was naive about his chances, but because accepting guilt for crimes he hadn't committed felt like a betrayal of everything Elena had taught him about integrity and truth. If he was going to lose everything, his house, his reputation, his freedom, he was going to lose it while fighting for the truth. The investigation that followed was thorough and humiliating. Detectives interviewed his neighbours, his co-workers, anyone who might have witnessed signs of David's alleged abusive behaviour. Carmen testified about her brother's character, about the gentle man who had cared for Elena through 18 months of cancer treatment without ever losing his patience or kindness. David's employer provided records showing his consistent work performance, his reputation for reliability and professionalism. Meanwhile, inconsistencies in Lila's story began to emerge. Her timeline of abuse didn't match medical records. Witnesses contradicted her claims about David's behaviour in public. Most damaging of all, immigration investigators discovered that she'd used the same strategy with two other men, both of whom had been too embarrassed or intimidated to press charges when similar situations had occurred. The truth, when it finally came out, was even worse than David had imagined. Lila was part of an organised network that targeted lonely American men, particularly widowers and divorcees who were emotionally vulnerable and financially stable. The women in this network shared information about potential marks, strategies for manipulation, and legal tactics for maintaining immigration status even when relationships soured. David hadn't been unlucky in love. He'd been selected, studied, and systematically destroyed by professionals. But by the time the charges were dropped and Lila was arrested for immigration fraud, David's life was already in ruins. He'd lost his job, his house had been foreclosed on while he fought the legal battles, and his reputation in the community was permanently damaged. Even people who believed in his innocence treated him differently, as if domestic violence charges left a permanent stain regardless of their validity. The deportation proceedings that followed were swift. Lila was returned to Vietnam within 3 months of her arrest, but not before she'd successfully transferred most of David's assets to accounts he could never recover. The money Elena and David had saved over 28 years of marriage was gone. The house they'd bought as newlyweds was sold to pay legal bills. Even Elena's engagement ring, which David had foolishly given to Lila as a symbol of their commitment, disappeared into the network of criminals who had orchestrated the entire scheme. What do you think? Have you or anyone you know ever encountered someone who seemed too good to be true? Leave a comment below and share your experience. And don't forget to subscribe to hear more stories like this one, because the warning signs are always there if you know how to look for them. The road back from complete devastation is longer than anyone who hasn't travelled it can imagine. David spent the first 6 months after Lila's deportation living with Carmen and her family, sleeping on a couch in his sister's living room like a teenager who'd made catastrophic life choices. The shame was overwhelming, not just because of the financial losses, but because of how completely he'd been fooled. Elena had always teased him about being too trusting, too willing to see the best in people. Now that trait, which had once been endearing, felt like a fundamental character flaw that had destroyed his life. The therapy sessions were Carmen's idea, but David found them surprisingly helpful. Dr. Martinez, not coincidentally sharing David's last name, was a specialist in trauma recovery who'd worked with other victims of romance scams. She helped David understand that his experience wasn't unique, that thousands of Americans fell victim to similar schemes every year. The criminals who'd targeted him were professionals, she explained, with years of experience manipulating vulnerable people. David's kindness hadn't been a weakness, it had been weaponized against him by people who understood exactly how to exploit basic human decency. Slowly, methodically, David began to rebuild. He found a new job with a smaller telecommunications company, taking a significant pay cut, but grateful for the chance to start over. He moved into a modest apartment, furnished it with items from thrift stores and yard sales. Every purchase was a small victory, a step toward independence and self-sufficiency. The man who'd once owned a 4-bedroom house and a healthy retirement account was starting over at 55 with little more than his technical skills and a hard-earned understanding of human nature. The legal aftermath continued for years. Immigration authorities used David's case as part of a larger investigation into organised marriage fraud, eventually breaking up the network that had targeted him. Several other victims came forward, men whose stories were remarkably similar to David's own. There was some comfort in knowing he wasn't alone, but also frustration that the system had failed so many people in such similar ways. David never recovered the money Lila had stolen. International law enforcement cooperation was limited, and even when authorities located some of the accounts, the funds had been dispersed through too many channels to trace. Elena's engagement ring was never found. The house he'd planned to live in until his death was sold to strangers who had no idea of the heartbreak that had occurred within its walls. But something unexpected happened during those difficult years of rebuilding. David discovered that he was stronger than he'd ever imagined. The man who'd felt helpless and broken after Elena's death found reserves of resilience he didn't know he possessed. He learned to live alone without being lonely, to find satisfaction in small pleasures, to trust his own judgment again. The process was slow and often painful, but it was real in ways that his relationship with Lila had never been. 3 years after Lila's deportation, David met Margaret at a grief counselling group. She was 62, a retired nurse whose husband had died in a car accident. Their friendship developed slowly, built on shared experience and mutual respect rather than romantic fantasy. They went to movies together, shared meals, talked about their deceased spouses without jealousy or competition. When they eventually moved in together, it was a practical decision made by two adults who understood the value of companionship without the need for grand romantic gestures. David never remarried. The legal complications of his marriage to Lila took years to fully resolve, and by the time they were settled, he'd discovered that legal commitment wasn't necessary for emotional fulfillment. He and Margaret built a life together based on trust, honesty, and the kind of deep friendship that can sustain two people through whatever challenges life presents. It wasn't the passionate love he'd shared with Elena or the intoxicating romance he'd imagined with Lila, but it was real and sustainable and healing. The most important lesson David learned was about the difference between being alone and being lonely. Elena's death had left him lonely, desperate for connection and meaning. That loneliness had made him vulnerable to manipulation, willing to overlook red flags and explain away inconsistencies because the alternative felt unbearable. But true solitude, he discovered, could be peaceful rather than painful. Learning to be content with his own company made him less desperate for validation from others, less likely to mistake attention for affection or gratitude for love. David also learned to recognise the warning signs he'd missed with Lila. The requests for money that started small and escalated quickly. The stories that didn't quite add up when examined closely. The isolation from friends and family disguised as romantic devotion. The way genuine gratitude differs from performed appreciation. These lessons came at an enormous cost, but they made him a wiser, more careful person. Today, David lives quietly but contentedly. He's 61 now, working part-time as a consultant for the telecommunications company that hired him after his ordeal. He and Margaret have a small garden where they grow vegetables and flowers, not because they need to save money on groceries, but because there's something satisfying about nurturing living things. He speaks occasionally at seminars about romance scams, sharing his story in the hope that other lonely people might recognise the warning signs he'd missed. The house he shares with Margaret is smaller than the one he'd owned with Elena, and much smaller than the one he'd imagined sharing with Lila, but it's filled with genuine warmth and honest conversation. There are photographs of Elena on the mantelpiece, not as shrines to the past, but as celebrations of love that was real and meaningful. Margaret has her own photographs of her deceased husband, and sometimes they share stories about their previous lives without jealousy or competition. David's relationship with his sister Carmen is stronger than it's ever been. She was his lifeline during the darkest period of his ordeal, and that experience created a bond that goes beyond simple family obligation. Her children, David's nieces and nephews, call him Uncle David and seek his advice about relationships and life decisions. He's learned to be honest about his mistakes while emphasising the importance of trust, communication, and taking relationships slowly enough to truly know someone before making major commitments. The financial recovery has been slow but steady. David will never have the retirement security he'd planned for during his marriage to Elena, but he's learned to live modestly and find satisfaction in experiences rather than possessions. He and Margaret travel occasionally, usually to visit national parks or historical sites. They read books together, watch classic movies, attend community theatre productions. Their pleasures are simple but genuine, unmarked by the artificial intensity that had characterised David's relationship with Lila. Most importantly, David has learned to forgive himself. The shame and self-recrimination that had nearly destroyed him in the aftermath of Lila's betrayal has been replaced by a more nuanced understanding of human nature. He'd been guilty of loneliness, of wanting to believe in love again, of trusting someone who'd expertly manipulated his kindness. These weren't crimes, and they didn't make him a fool. They made him human, and learning to accept his own humanity was perhaps the most important part of his recovery. The story doesn't have a fairy tale ending because real life rarely does. David's money is still gone, his house is still owned by strangers, and Elena is still dead. But he's found something that might be more valuable than any of those things. The knowledge that he can survive devastating betrayal and rebuild a meaningful life from the wreckage. He's learned that love doesn't require desperation, that companionship doesn't require deception, and that being alone is infinitely preferable to being with someone who doesn't respect your worth. If there's hope in David's story, it's not the hope for perfect love or complete recovery from loss, it's the hope that human beings are more resilient than they imagine, that wisdom can emerge from even the most painful experiences, and that it's never too late to start over. David's life at 61 is nothing like what he'd planned at 50, but it's authentic in ways that his marriage to Lila never was. He's learnt the difference between being rescued and being exploited, between gratitude and manipulation, between love and performance. The greatest gift Elena had given David wasn't their 28 years of marriage, though those had been precious beyond measure. It was the foundation of genuine love that helped him recognise the difference between real affection and elaborate deception. Even in his loneliness and vulnerability, some part of him had known that what he shared with Lila wasn't the same as what he'd shared with Elena. That knowledge, buried beneath desperation and wishful thinking, had eventually saved him. To anyone listening to this story who recognises elements of their own experience, David's message is simple. Trust your instincts. If something feels too good to be true, if someone's gratitude seems excessive, if requests for help become demands for control, pay attention to those warning signs. Loneliness is painful, but being exploited by someone who pretends to love you is infinitely worse. Take relationships slowly, maintain your independence, and remember that genuine love enhances your life rather than consuming it. And if you've already fallen victim to someone like Lila, know that recovery is possible. It won't be quick or easy, and you may never recover everything you've lost. But you can rebuild a life that's authentic and meaningful, surrounded by people who appreciate you for who you really are, rather than what you can provide for them. The shame and self-blame will fade with time, replaced by wisdom and strength you never knew you possessed. David's story is ultimately about more than romance scams or immigration fraud. It's about the human capacity for both cruelty and resilience, about the ways desperate people can exploit each other, and about the possibility of finding genuine connection even after experiencing profound betrayal. It's a reminder that our greatest weaknesses, our loneliness, our desire to be needed, our willingness to trust, can also be sources of strength when properly understood and carefully guarded. The phone calls from immigration enforcement stopped years ago. The legal battles are long over. The money is permanently gone, and the woman who stole it is presumably living somewhere in Vietnam, possibly targeting new victims, or possibly having moved on to other forms of crime. David doesn't think about Lila often anymore, and when he does, it's without the anger that once consumed him. She was a criminal who did criminal things, and understanding that has allowed him to stop taking her betrayal personally. What David thinks about instead is the future he's building with Margaret, the conversations they have over dinner, the quiet satisfaction of tending their garden together. He thinks about his nieces and nephews, about the advice he can offer them based on hard-won experience. He thinks about Elena, not with the desperate longing that once characterised his grief, but with gratitude for the love they shared and the lessons she taught him about recognising authentic affection. Most of all, David thinks about the man he's become as a result of his ordeal. He's more careful now, but not cynical. More independent, but not isolated. More aware of human nature's capacity for deception, but not closed off to human nature's capacity for genuine warmth. The experience that nearly destroyed him has paradoxically made him a better judge of character and a more appreciative partner to someone who deserves his trust. If you've made it this far in David's story, thank you for listening. Stories like this one are difficult to tell and difficult to hear, but they're important because they happen to real people every day. If this story has taught you something about the warning signs of manipulation, if it's helped you understand the difference between love and exploitation, or if it's simply reminded you to trust your instincts in relationships, then sharing David's painful experience has served a purpose. Remember to subscribe to this channel for more real stories about real people facing extraordinary challenges. Leave a comment below about your own experiences with trust and betrayal, or share this story with someone who might benefit from hearing it. And remember that no matter how dark things may seem, no matter how completely you may have been deceived or betrayed, recovery is possible. You are stronger than you know, wiser than you realise, and deserving of relationships that honour your worth rather than exploit your vulnerabilities. Keep watching for more stories of survival, resilience, and the complicated but ultimately hopeful nature of human connection.